Hey everyone, and welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into one of the most fascinating historical tensions of the 20th century. We're looking at the clash between rigid authoritarian regimes and the wildly unpredictable nature of the beautiful game. You see, during the Cold War, states operating behind the Iron Curtain tried to apply their incredibly strict political and social frameworks to literally every aspect of life, and sport was absolutely no exception. But as you'll see today, trying to control the chaotic, passionate, and deeply human game of football proved to be a massively complicated and sometimes even deadly endeavor.
Okay, let's look at a roadmap for today. We're going to start with how ideology met the pitch, then explore the Stasi's football team and the very real price of defection. After that, we'll get into the Soviet science experiment, blatant corruption in Romania, and wrap things up with a massive 1966 diplomatic headache.
Part 1. Ideology meets the pitch. Let's look at the initial communist dilemma.
To really understand this bizarre history, we have to grasp the huge problem the sport presented to these leaders in the first place. Early on, the Bolsheviks actually despised football. They viewed it as bourgeois and anti-revolutionary. They genuinely believed it was just this cheap distraction cooked up by capitalists to divide the working class and weaken their revolutionary drive. But there was a massive flaw in this theory. The working class absolutely loved football. Realizing that an outright ban would just obliterate their support among the masses, the regimes pivoted. They figured, hey, if we can't beat the game, we have to own it. We have to control it. And this brilliantly illustrates the staggering gap between what the regimes promised and what they actually delivered. On the surface, they promoted this utopian socialist ideal where football would represent grassroots equality, and players would just be humble ambassadors in tracksuits showing off the glories of the system. But the Iron Curtain reality, it was anything but equal. Authoritarian states basically built these crushing sporting monopolies. A perfect example of this is Dukla Prague over in Czechoslovakia. They were the quintessential army team. Because they were backed by the military, they didn't have to bother scouting or negotiating. They could literally just draft any potential star in the entire country to play for them, hoarding generational talents like the European Footballer of the Year, Josef Masopust. It was pure state-sponsored domination.
Moving on to Part 2, the Stasi's football team.
If we really want to see the absolute darkest methods of state control over a single football club, we've got to travel to East Germany and meet BFC Dynamo, basically Stasi FC. This club became the personal pet project of Erich Mielke, the fanatical head of the East German secret police. Mielke didn't just want political power in East Berlin. The guy wanted to hoard sporting trophies too. And you know, when the head of the largest secret police apparatus in the world decides he wants his football team to win, he doesn't exactly need a lavish transfer budget. He just bends the entire system to his will.
Mielke's tactics were incredibly brazen. Promising young players from across the country weren't courted, they were commanded. If a player refused to transfer to BFC Dynamo, they were flat out told their competitive sports career was over, period. And the referees, they were absolutely terrified of having the heavy hand of the Stasi on their shoulders, so they reliably blew their whistles in Dynamo's favor. There's this one infamous match in 1986 against Lokomotiv Leipzig, where the referee sent off Leipzig's captain for a totally trivial offense and then literally just kept the match going until he could hand Dynamo a completely unjustified penalty in the 95th minute. And honestly, worse yet, the Stasi heavily spied on their own players, creating this deeply toxic environment of constant paranoia.
Now, this culture of intimidation definitely yielded results, at least domestically. BFC Dynamo won a staggering 10 consecutive championships in the East German top flight. 10! But it came at the cost of total resentment. Nobody respected their wins. Even their own players felt embarrassed by the blatant refereeing bias. They basically became the most hated team in the entire country.
Which brings us to Part 3, the price of defection.
Now you might be wondering, what exactly happened to players who actually managed to flee to the West? Because escaping the Stasi was no easy feat. For the highly talented players trapped inside this system, the allure of playing freely in the West was incredibly strong. But jumping ship from a prestige project like Stasi FC was a massive, unforgivable loss of face for the regime, and the secret police retaliated with horrifying precision.
Let's look at the timeline to see how this chilling retaliation played out for Litz Eigendorf. He was one of BFC Dynamo's star midfielders, and get this, a personal favorite of Erich Mielke himself. But in 1979, during a team tour, Eigendorf actually managed to escape his minders and sought asylum in West Germany. The Ministry for State Security was absolutely furious. By 1980, they had as many as 50 informants tracking his every single movement in the West. 50! Then, to send a terrifying message to anyone else even thinking about leaving, the Stasi ran a sting operation in 1981. They arrested 3 players from a rival team, Dynamo Dresden, and locked them up for 11 months just for deserting the Republic. And then, in 1983, the unthinkable happens. Eigendorf dies in a highly suspicious, fatal car crash. Now, while it's never been officially proven in a court of law, historians and former players have very little doubt that the Stasi orchestrated his assassination. It's like a true crime nightmare.
Part 4. The Soviet Science Experiment.
So, not every Iron Curtain country relied purely on brute force and intimidation. The Dynamo Kiev experiment in Ukraine shows us an entirely different, highly innovative attempt to control the game. A professor named Anatoly Zelentsov teamed up with legendary coach Valery Lobanovsky, and they decided that football wasn't some unpredictable art form. They viewed it as a science that could be completely solved. Decades before the rest of the world caught on to this kind of stuff, they introduced deep sports science. They literally forced players to play computer games to test and improve their spatial awareness and mental agility. Players had to memorize incredibly complex set plays so they knew exactly where every single teammate would be on the pitch at any given second. They analyzed deep performance statistics to build a ruthless, machine-like team. And you know what? It worked brilliantly. This approach won them 2 European Cup winners' cups and essentially laid the entire groundwork for modern football analytics. It was a real game changer.
Next up, Part 5. Corruption in Romania.
While the Soviets were applying cutting-edge science, Romania shows how the attempt to manufacture sporting success could easily cross the line into absolute, hilarious absurdity. 18-0. Just think about that number for a second. During the regime of Nicolae Ceausescu, a massive stadium was built in his tiny home village, and the local team, FC Olt, was rapidly and artificially pushed up the leagues. On the last day of the 1979 season, they needed to win on goal difference to secure promotion to the top tier. And wouldn't you know it, miraculously, they won their final match 18-0. It was the most blatant, transparent match fixing you could possibly imagine, totally rubber-stamped by the state. And this wild corruption extended to individual awards too. In 1987, Romanian forward Radian Camataru miraculously scored 18 goals in his final 6 matches of the season. Why the sudden scoring streak? Well, the regime wanted him to win the European Golden Boot, which, at the time, was quite literally a solid gold shoe that would have significantly added to the state's precious metal reserves. I mean, you can't make this stuff up. The manipulation was so incredibly obvious that the award was eventually stripped from him in 1990. Finally, Part 6, a 1966 diplomatic headache.
Let's bring this story out of the Eastern Bloc and onto British soil, just to see how the geopolitical tensions of communist football created absolute chaos in the West. In 1966, England hosted the World Cup, and to the absolute horror of the British Foreign Office, the Communist Democratic People's Republic of Korea, a country Britain did not officially recognize as a legitimate state, qualified for the tournament. Terrified of upsetting the United States and accidentally triggering a Cold War incident, the British government went into full-blown panic mode. They forced the team to only go by the name North Korea. They ordered stadiums to hide national flags just to avoid flying the North Korean one. They canceled pre-match anthems for almost all the games. They even ruled that Her Majesty the Queen couldn't be photographed shaking hands with the squad. The Foreign Office figured, well, it won't matter much anyway. They just assumed that North Koreans were terrible at football and would be eliminated immediately.
But as you might guess, the North Koreans completely ruined all of the government's carefully laid diplomatic plans by actually being brilliant at football. In front of 19,000 fans in Middlesbrough, they stunned the former world champions, Italy, winning 1-0 and advancing to the quarterfinals. Far from being this quiet little diplomatic anomaly to be swept under the rug, they played with such amazing skill and heart that they completely won over the English crowds. Thousands of local fans even traveled all the way across the country just to cheer for them in their next match against Portugal.
So, the crucial point we need to take away here is this. Authoritarian states poured immense resources into molding football to fit their rigid ideologies. They used secret police, forced drafts, cutting-edge science, and downright laughable corruption to try and control the game. But, as the British Foreign Office learned in 1966, and as the East German fans showed when they turned their backs on Stasi FC, you just cannot fully script this sport. The beautiful game, with all of its passion, its flaws, and its wild human unpredictability, remained defiantly uncontainable. So what do you think? Can the chaotic power of sport ever truly be contained by politics or diplomacy? Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer today. Keep questioning the history behind the headlines, and I'll see you next time.